Commander Veltara stood on the bridge of her massive warship, watching stars streak past through the viewport. Her silver skin gleamed under the bridge lights, and battle scars marked her 7-foot frame like medals of honor. For 15 years, she had been the terror of 3 star systems. Pirates fled at the mention of her name. Enemy fleets surrendered rather than face her in battle. "Commander, we have something on sensors," called out her weapons officer, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the bridge. Veltara turned her 4 eyes toward the tactical display. A small blip appeared on the screen, drifting alone in the vast emptiness of space near the Kepler Nebula. The ship looked tiny compared to her massive dreadnought, barely worth her attention. "What is it?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a battle. "Appears to be a human cargo vessel, Commander. Heavily damaged. No active weapons systems detected." The bridge crew exchanged glances. Humans were still considered a minor species by the Kethmori Empire. Their technology was primitive, their ships small and fragile. Most Kethmori warriors viewed them as little more than clever animals who had somehow learned to build spaceships. Veltara studied the readouts with interest. The human vessel showed signs of recent combat damage with hull breaches and failing power systems. It was exactly the kind of easy salvage that could yield useful materials or information. "Any life signs?" she inquired. "Negative, Commander. The ship appears abandoned." "Perfect." Veltara had been patrolling this sector for weeks without finding anything worthwhile. A derelict human ship might contain valuable cargo or interesting technology that her engineers could study. Even primitive human computers sometimes held useful navigation data or trade routes. "Prepare a boarding party," she ordered. "Standard, salvage protocol. Strip anything of value and prepare to scuttle the vessel." Her lieutenant nodded and began organizing the salvage team. Within minutes, 20 Kethmori warriors in full combat armor were ready to board the human ship. Their plasma rifles gleamed under the hangar bay lights as they climbed into the boarding shuttle. Veltara watched from the bridge as her team approached the damaged vessel. Everything seemed routine. The human ship drifted helplessly, its engines, cold and its weapons offline. Her sensors showed no signs of life aboard the vessel. "Beginning boarding operations," reported the team leader over the comm system. The shuttle attached to the human ship's airlock with a metallic clang that echoed through both vessels. Veltara's warriors cut through the sealed doors and entered the darkened corridors of the cargo ship. Their helmet cameras transmitted grainy images back to the main bridge. "Looks like they abandoned ship in a hurry," came the voice of Sergeant Koltar, her most experienced boarding specialist. "Personal belongings scattered everywhere. No bodies, though." Veltara nodded. Humans were smart enough to use escape pods when their ships were critically damaged. The crew had probably evacuated hours or even days ago, leaving behind only their cargo and whatever equipment they couldn't carry. "Proceed to the cargo holds," she instructed. "Look for anything useful." But as her boarding team moved deeper into the human vessel, something felt wrong. The ship's layout seemed odd, with too many redundant power systems and unusual electromagnetic shielding in unexpected places. Veltara's warrior instincts, honed by years of combat, began to whisper warnings. "Commander," called her sensor operator, his voice tense with concern. "I'm detecting some strange energy readings from the human ship. The patterns don't match standard cargo vessel configurations." Before Veltara could respond, alarms began screaming across her bridge. Red warning lights bathed everything in an angry glow as her ship's systems started failing one by one. The main engines shut down first, followed by weapons, shields, and life support systems. "Report," she shouted over the chaos. "It's some kind of electromagnetic pulse weapon," her chief engineer yelled back. "The human ship was a trap. All our primary systems are offline." Veltara felt her blood run cold. She had walked straight into a carefully laid ambush. The supposedly abandoned cargo vessel had been bait, designed to lure Kethmori ships close enough to deploy an experimental EMP weapon that could cripple their advanced technology. "Emergency power," she commanded, but even the backup systems were struggling to come online. The massive dreadnought that had been her pride and joy was now little more than a drifting tomb. Without engines or life support, they had perhaps an hour before the ship became uninhabitable. "All hands, abandon ship," Veltara ordered, her voice carrying across the failing communication systems. "Emergency evacuation procedures now." Her crew moved with disciplined efficiency despite the crisis. Escape pods launched one after another, carrying her warriors to safety. But as Veltara made her way toward the command deck's emergency exit, the ship's damaged structure finally gave way to the stress. A massive support beam, weakened by the electromagnetic pulse, crashed down from the ceiling with a thunderous roar. Veltara threw herself aside, but the falling metal caught her legs, pinning her beneath tons of twisted steel. Pain shot through her body as she tried to free herself, but the beam was too heavy even for her considerable strength. Emergency lighting flickered and died, leaving her trapped in growing darkness as the ship's remaining power systems failed completely. Kim Dae-ho rubbed his tired eyes as he stared at the navigation screen of his small salvage ship. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't have the energy to make another cup. 3 years of scraping by on salvage runs had worn him down more than he cared to admit. Ever since losing his steady job at the mining station on Kepler Colony, life had become a constant struggle to pay for fuel, food, and ship repairs. His vessel, the Lucky Strike, wasn't much to look at. The hull showed patches from countless micrometeor impacts, and the engines made concerning noises that his mechanic friend kept saying he should fix real soon now. But it was home, and more importantly, it was his. The proximity alarm chimed, softly, pulling him from his thoughts. Dae-ho looked up to see something massive appearing on his sensors. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the distinctive angular shape of a Kethmori dreadnought. These ships were legendary throughout human space, each one capable of destroying entire fleets. "What's a warship doing out here?" he muttered, adjusting his sensors for a better look. The massive vessel hung motionless in space, dark and silent. No engine glow, no communication signals, no signs of active systems. Dae-ho had seen enough derelict ships to recognize one when he saw it, but this was different. Kethmori vessels didn't just break down and get abandoned. Their technology was far too advanced for that. His scanners picked up strange electromagnetic readings emanating from a smaller ship nearby. The energy signature looked human, but unlike anything he'd seen before. Whatever had happened here, it had been recent and violent. Every instinct told him to turn around and fly away as fast as his engines could carry him. Getting involved with Kethmori affairs was a sure way to end up dead or worse. The Empire didn't distinguish between innocent, bystanders and enemies when it came to protecting their secrets. But something made him pause. His life sign detectors were picking up a single weak signal deep inside the massive warship. Someone was still alive in there, trapped in a vessel that was slowly dying around them. Dae-ho stared at the reading for a long moment. He thought about his grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a transport accident. She used to tell him stories about the old days, when humans looked out for each other no matter what. "It doesn't matter where someone comes from," she would say. "When someone needs help, you help. That's what makes us human." Of course, she had never dealt with 7-foot-tall alien warriors who could tear a person in half with their bare hands. But the principle remained the same, didn't it? "This is probably the stupidest thing I've ever done," he said to himself as he changed course toward the dreadnought. Getting inside the alien ship proved easier than expected. The electromagnetic pulse that had disabled its systems had also knocked out most of its security measures. Dae-ho's cutting torch made quick work of an external maintenance hatch, and soon he was floating through corridors designed for beings much larger than himself. The ship's interior was a maze of twisted metal and sparking electronics. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the air tasted of ozone and burned circuits. Dae-ho followed his handheld scanner toward the life sign, climbing over debris and squeezing through passages that had been partially collapsed by the ship's structural failure. It took him nearly an hour to reach the engine room where his scanner indicated the survivor was located. What he found there made him stop in shock. A massive alien warrior lay pinned beneath a support beam that must have weighed several tons. Her silver skin was marked with scars that spoke of countless battles, and her 4 eyes tracked his movement, with predatory alertness despite her obvious pain. This was clearly a high-ranking Kethmori officer, probably the ship's commander. Veltara looked up at the small human who had somehow found her in the depths of her dying ship. She had expected death to come in the form of system failure or oxygen depletion, not as a curious little creature with concerned eyes and strange equipment strapped to his back. "Come to finish me, little meat?" she growled, baring her fangs in what humans might mistake for a smile. Deho flinched at the hostility in her voice but didn't back away. Instead, he knelt down and began examining the fallen beam that had her trapped. "Actually, I came to help," he said, pulling out his plasma cutter. Veltara's eyes narrowed in confusion. This made no sense. Humans and Keth Mori had been enemies for decades. Her people had conquered human colonies, enslaved human populations, and treated the species as little more than intelligent animals. Why would one of them risk his life to save her? "You lie," she hissed. "Humans are cowards and scavengers. You're here to loot my ship." Deho looked up from his examination of the beam. "If I wanted to loot your ship, I wouldn't need to free you first. This is going to take a while, and I'll need to share my oxygen supply with you. The beam is wedged against a power conduit, so I'll have to cut very carefully to avoid electrocuting both of us." For the next 4 hours, the small human worked tirelessly to free her. He shared his emergency oxygen canister when her breathing became labored, and used his engineering knowledge to safely cut through the alien metal without triggering an explosion. When she asked again why he was helping an enemy, his answer was simple and completely unexpected. "My grandmother raised me to believe that nobody should die alone in the dark. Doesn't matter what species they are." The medical bay aboard Daiho's small salvage ship looked pathetic compared to the advanced facilities Veltara was used to. The human had done his best to make her comfortable, but the ceiling was too low for her 7-foot frame, and the bed creaked under her weight. Her legs were wrapped in primitive human bandages, though she had to admit they were healing faster than expected. Veltara stared at the cramped metal walls and tried to make sense of what had happened. A human had saved her life. Not just any human, but a lowly salvage worker who had risked everything to pull her from the wreckage of her own command ship. The whole situation went against everything she had been taught about the inferior species that called themselves humanity. Deho appeared in the doorway carrying a steaming cup of something that smelled surprisingly good. His clothes were still stained with oil and metal dust from the rescue operation, and exhaustion showed clearly on his face. He had barely slept since bringing her aboard 3 days ago. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting the cup on a small table beside her makeshift bed. "I will survive," she replied curtly. The truth was that her legs were healing well, and she would be able to walk normally within a week. Keth Mori biology was remarkably resilient, something that had served her well during years of warfare. "Good. I've been monitoring the communication channels, and it looks like your people think you died with your ship. The official reports list Commander Veltara as killed in action during a classified operation." She turned her 4 eyes toward him, studying his expression. "And what do you intend to do with this information, human?" Deho sat down in the room's only chair, which looked fragile beneath even his modest weight. "I was hoping you could tell me. I can't exactly drop you off at a Keth Mori outpost and wave goodbye. Your empire has a bounty on my head that could buy 3 ships like this one." "What did you do to earn their displeasure?" Veltara asked, genuinely curious. Most humans were careful to avoid attracting Keth Mori attention. "Wrong place, wrong time," he said with a bitter laugh. "I was doing a salvage job near Tau Ceti when I witnessed some of your people executing prisoners. Human colonists who had surrendered and were supposed to be protected under the war accords. I recorded everything before they spotted me and managed to escape." Veltara felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had heard rumors about unauthorized executions but had always dismissed them as enemy propaganda. "You have proof of these allegations?" "Enough to get me killed if they catch me." The footage shows Keth Mori soldiers in full uniform murdering civilians. Children, elderly people, medical personnel, all of them defenseless. The alien warrior closed her eyes. If what he said was true, then some of her people had violated the most basic codes of honorable warfare. Such actions brought shame upon the entire empire and made a mockery of everything she had fought for. "This evidence," she said slowly, "you still possess it?" hidden in 3 different data caches. If something happens to me, it gets transmitted to every news network in human space. They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Veltara spoke again. According to the laws of my people, I owe you a life debt. You saved me when you could have left me to die, and you ask for nothing in return. This creates an obligation that I cannot simply ignore. Deho looked uncomfortable. I don't want anything from you. Just help me get to neutral space where I can disappear for a while. Maybe find work on one of the outer rim colonies where nobody asks too many questions. It is not that simple, Veltara explained. A life debt among the Kethmori is sacred. It binds the debtor until the obligation is properly discharged. But acknowledging such a debt to a human would be seen as admitting that your species is worthy of respect. And that's a problem? For a high-ranking commander like myself, it would be considered a sign of weakness or madness. My own people would strip me of rank and exile me from the Empire. Deho rubbed his forehead tiredly. So we're both stuck. You can't go home because you owe me something, and I can't go home because your people want me dead. Perhaps, Veltara said thoughtfully. Or perhaps this is an opportunity to examine the truth behind this conflict. Over the following days, as they traveled through the lonely space between star systems, an unlikely partnership began to form. Deho shared stories of his life as a salvager, describing the dozens of worlds he had visited and the many species he had encountered. His knowledge surprised her. He spoke several alien languages fluently, understood complex engineering principles, and had a grasp of galactic politics that rivaled many of her own officers. Veltara found herself questioning assumptions she had held for years. This human displayed courage, intelligence, and moral principles that her people claimed were impossible for the inferior species. When he refused her offer to simply drop him at the nearest human outpost because it would put innocent people at risk, she began to understand that perhaps her empire's view of humanity was fundamentally flawed. The crisis came when Kethmori interceptors found them near the Vega system. Captain Mordak, one of Veltara's former subordinates, appeared on the communication screen with suspicion written across his scarred features. Commander Veltara, we received reports that you had been killed in action. What is your status? She looked at Deho, who stood just out of view of the camera. One word from her would doom him to execution or worse, but staying silent would mean revealing her own shameful situation to a subordinate who would certainly report it to their superiors. I survived the destruction of my vessel, she said carefully. This human is my prisoner. Captain Mordak's scarred face filled the communication screen, his suspicious eyes studying every detail of the transmission. Veltara could feel sweat forming on her silver skin, despite the cool air of Deho's small ship. Her former subordinate had always been observant, a quality that had served him well in battle, but now made him dangerous. Commander, your ship was reported destroyed with all hands. How did you survive? Mordak asked, his voice carrying the formal tone of an official inquiry. Emergency systems allowed me to reach an escape pod before total structural failure. Veltara lied smoothly. I was able to capture this human scavenger who came to loot the wreckage. Behind the camera, Deho stood perfectly still. They had rehearsed this story during their journey, but both knew how fragile the deception was. One wrong word could expose everything. I see, Mordak said slowly. And this human was alone? No other vessels in the area? Correct. A single salvage operator working the outer rim. Veltara kept her voice steady and authoritative, the same tone she had used when commanding fleets. I am transporting him to the nearest detention facility for interrogation. Mordak's eyes narrowed slightly. Something in her manner seemed to trouble him, though he couldn't quite identify what. Commander, High Command has issued new standing orders regarding human prisoners. All captured personnel are to be transferred immediately to military custody for enhanced interrogation. Veltara felt her heart sink. Enhanced interrogation was a polite term for torture that often ended in death. I understand, Captain. However, this prisoner may have valuable intelligence about human salvage operations in the sector. I believe a more thorough approach would yield better results. With respect, Commander, those are not our orders. I must insist that you transfer the prisoner to my vessel immediately. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut. Veltara knew that refusing a direct order from High Command would mark her as a traitor, but she couldn't bring herself to hand Deho over to certain death, not after everything he had done for her. Before she could respond, Deho stepped into view of the camera. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet determination. "I won't let her sacrifice her honor for me," he said directly to Mordak. "If you want a prisoner, Captain, then you'll have to take me by force." The effect was immediate. Mordak's expression shifted from suspicion to certainty. "So the human speaks our language. Interesting." He turned his attention back to Veltara. "Commander, it appears your prisoner is not as secure as you claimed. Stand down your engines and prepare to be boarded." "I cannot do that," Veltara replied, her voice taking on the steel edge that had made her legendary in battle. "Then you force my hand. All ships, target the human vessel. Disable their engines but keep the hull intact. We need that prisoner alive." The communication link cut off, leaving them alone in the sudden silence of the small ship. Deho looked at Veltara with something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I couldn't let you lie for me anymore." "You fool," she replied, but there was no anger in her voice. "Now we must fight our way out, and the odds are not favorable." 3 Kethmori interceptors moved into attack formation around their small vessel. Each one was heavily armed and designed for combat, while Daiho's salvage ship was built for cargo hauling and fuel efficiency. In any conventional battle, they would be destroyed in seconds. "Any brilliant ideas?" Veltara asked as she strapped herself into the co-pilot seat. Daiho's hands flew over the controls, bringing the ship's meager defenses online. "Actually, yes, but you're not going to like it. At this point, I am willing to consider any option. We're going to ram the nearest asteroid and use the debris cloud as cover while we run for the hyperspace jump point." Veltara stared at him in disbelief. "That is not a tactic. That is suicide." "Sometimes the difference between the two is just a matter of timing," Deho replied with a grin that was either brave or completely insane. The first enemy shots sparked off their hull as Deho threw the ship into a wild, evasive pattern that no Kethmori pilot would have attempted. He flew straight at a massive asteroid, ignoring the proximity alarms that screamed warnings about collision course. At the last possible second, he fired their mining charges directly into the rock face. The asteroid exploded in a cloud of dust and debris that spread out like a gray fog. Deho dove the ship directly into the chaos, using the interference to mask their engine signature while the Kethmori ships lost them in the confusion. "Impossible," Veltara breathed as they emerged from the debris field on the opposite side, engines at full power toward the hyperspace jump point. "Human tactics," Deho explained. "We're not stronger or faster than most species, so we learn to be more creative." Behind them, Mordak's ships struggled to reorganize and pursue, but the head start was enough. The hyperspace engines engaged, just as the first pursuit craft emerged from the asteroid debris, carrying them away to safety. As the stars stretched into lines around them, Veltara realized that her old life was over. She was now a fugitive from her own empire, branded as a traitor for protecting a human. But strangely, she felt no regret. For the first time in years, she had acted according to her own moral code rather than following orders. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere we can figure out how to expose the truth about those war crimes," Deho replied. "Your people deserve to know what's being done in their name." The neutral trading station Nexus Point buzzed with activity as beings from dozens of different species conducted business in its crowded corridors. Veltara pulled her hooded cloak tighter around her distinctive silver skin as she and Deho made their way through the marketplace. 3 weeks had passed since their escape from Captain Mordak, and they had spent that time gathering intelligence about the conspiracy within her empire. What they discovered was worse than either had imagined. The war crimes Deho had witnessed were not isolated incidents but part of a coordinated campaign by extremist factions within the Kethmori military. These groups were deliberately targeting human civilian populations to provoke retaliation, hoping to justify a full-scale genocide that would eliminate humanity as a threat forever. The War Council meets tomorrow, Veltara said quietly as they ducked into a small cafe that catered to species who preferred dim lighting. General Thexmore will present his final proposal for the human solution to the assembled fleet commanders. Deho sipped his coffee, a luxury he had splurged on despite their dwindling credits. And if they approve it? The convoy of human refugee ships currently traveling through the Kepler Nebula will be destroyed. 50,000 civilians, including families evacuating from the contested worlds. Their deaths will be blamed on mechanical failures, and the Empire will claim it as proof that humans cannot safely operate in deep space. The weight of what they were discussing settled over them like a heavy blanket. 50,000 innocent lives hung in the balance, and they were the only ones who could prevent the massacre. The communications array is heavily guarded, Deho observed, studying the station schematics on his datapad. Security checkpoints at every level, biometric scanners, armed patrols. Getting in there will be nearly impossible. Not impossible, Veltara corrected. Merely very dangerous. She had been studying the problem for days, using her knowledge of Kethmori's security protocols to identify weaknesses in the station's defenses. The communications center was indeed well protected, but it had one vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with the right access codes and timing. The shift change happens at 300 station time, she explained. For exactly 12 minutes, there will be a gap in the security rotation, while the night guards brief their replacements. If we can reach the array during that window, we might have enough time to transmit your evidence before they stop us. Deho looked at the complicated plan she had sketched out. It involved crawling through maintenance tunnels, bypassing 3 separate security systems, and somehow avoiding the dozen guards who would be patrolling the area. Even if everything went perfectly, they would have perhaps 5 minutes to broadcast the data before station security arrived in force. You know this is a one-way trip, he said quietly. Even if we succeed, we'll never make it out of there alive. Veltara nodded solemnly. I am aware of the risks, but I have spent my entire life serving an empire that I believed stood for honor and strength. I will not allow that legacy to be stained by the actions of cowards who murdered defenseless civilians. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the mission. Deho modified a portable data transmitter to interface with Kethmori systems, while Veltara used her connections in the underground to acquire security uniforms and forged identification cards. As the station's artificial night cycle began, they made their final preparations. Are you sure about this? Deho asked as they stood outside the maintenance access hatch that would begin their infiltration. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Veltara replied. My people deserve to know the truth even if it destroys me. The journey through the station's inner workings was a nightmare of cramped spaces and hidden dangers. They crawled through ventilation shafts barely large enough for Deho's human frame, while Veltara had to contort her larger body into impossible positions. Twice they had to freeze in place as maintenance workers passed below them, and once a security patrol came so close that they could hear individual conversations. Finally, after what felt like hours but was actually only 45 minutes, they reached the communications center. The shift change was happening exactly as Veltara had predicted, with guards moving through their rotation procedures with mechanical precision. Now, she whispered, and they dropped down from the ceiling access panel into the dimly lit control room. Deho's fingers flew over the human-designed components of the hybrid communication system, while Veltara interfaced with the Kethmori controls. The evidence files began uploading to every major news network, military communication channel, and government database in the galaxy. Video footage of the executions, audio recordings of planning meetings, classified documents detailing the conspiracy. Everything poured out in a digital flood that could never be stopped or recalled. Transmission at 60%, Deho reported, sweat beading on his forehead as he worked to maintain the connection. Alarms began blaring throughout the station as security systems detected the unauthorized broadcast. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridors outside as armed guards rushed toward their location. 80%, Deho called out over the noise. The doors burst open and laser fire filled the air around them. Veltara threw herself over the controls, using her own body, to shield the equipment from the attacking guards. 95%, Deho shouted. Almost there. Transmission complete, the computer announced in its calm, artificial voice. The truth was out. Across the galaxy, beings of every species were receiving undeniable proof of the Keth Mori conspiracy. Government officials, military commanders, journalists, and ordinary citizens all saw the evidence at the same time, making any cover-up impossible. 6 months later, Veltara stood on the observation deck of the peacekeeping vessel New Dawn, watching as human and Keth Mori children played together in the station's recreation area below. The revolution that followed their broadcast had torn apart the old empire and led to the first genuine peace talks in decades. She and Deho had survived the firefight, though both bore scars from that desperate night. More importantly, they had found a new purpose working together as independent peacekeepers, protecting the innocent regardless of species or politics. Any regrets? Deho asked, joining her at the viewport. Veltara smiled, something she had learned to do from watching humans express joy. Only that it took so long to understand what true honor really means. The legendary warrior had traded her empire for something far more valuable, the chance to build a better future for all beings, one life at a time.